They left me here to die. The planet was a wasteland, a barren expanse of jagged black rock and crimson skies that churned like a boiling sea. The air was thin and laced with something metallic, sharp enough to make my lungs ache with every breath. The gravity was heavier than Earth's, pressing down on me like an invisible hand trying to grind me into the ground. Even the light was wrong. 2 suns hung in the sky, one a pale white dwarf, the other a bloated red giant, casting everything in a sickly twilight. It was a place where life had no business existing. And that was the point. The Ketheri had made it clear. I wasn't worth the effort to kill outright. A human engineer, stripped of tools, weapons, and hope, marooned on a dead world light years from home. A punishment for my defiance. A warning to my species. They underestimated me. I sat there for hours after their ship vanished into the blood-red sky, staring at the horizon where it had disappeared. My body wanted to collapse, to give in to despair and exhaustion. But my mind wouldn't let me. I wasn't dead yet, and as long as I was breathing, no matter how painful it was, I had work to do. The first priority was shelter. The nights here were colder than anything I'd ever experienced, dropping so far below freezing that even the rocks seemed to crack and groan in protest. I found a shallow cave carved into the side of a basalt cliff and dragged myself inside, just as the twin suns dipped below the horizon. The temperature plummeted instantly, frost forming on my skin before I could even think about sleep. I spent that first night huddled in darkness, teeth chattering so hard I thought they'd shatter. When dawn came, I began to explore. The Ketheri weren't fools. They wouldn't have left me here if there were any obvious resources I could use against them. But they didn't know humans like I did. They didn't understand what desperation could do to a mind like mine. Every rock, every crevice, every gust of wind became a puzzle piece waiting to be solved. I found traces of something metallic in the cliffs near my cave, veins of or running through the stone like frozen rivers. It wasn't much, but it was enough to spark an idea. If I could extract it, refine it, well, that was a problem for later. First, I needed fire. There were no trees here, no plants of any kind. But there were strange crystalline formations scattered across the landscape, spires of translucent material that hummed faintly when touched. I shattered one with a rock and found that it burned when exposed to friction, a cold flame that flickered blue and white but gave off enough heat to warm my hands. It took weeks, maybe months, time blurred together, but eventually I had fire, crude tools chipped from stone, and a rudimentary forge built from scavenged materials. My hands were raw and blistered, my body emaciated from subsisting on nothing but water collected from condensation on the cave walls. But I didn't care. Every day was progress. The Ketheri thought they'd left me with nothing. They didn't realize they'd left me with everything, my mind. I built bellows from strips of fabric torn from my jumpsuit and stitched together with fibers pulled from those crystalline spires. I melted down chunks of ore in my forge until they yielded crude ingots of metal. Not much better than iron, but strong enough for what I needed. The first thing I forged was a knife. It wasn't pretty, jagged and misshapen, but it cut through rock and crystal alike with enough force behind it. With that knife came more tools. Chisels for carving stone, hammers for shaping metal, tongs for handling molten ore. Each new tool opened up more possibilities. Months turned into years, or so it felt, and my cave transformed into something more. A workshop filled with makeshift machines cobbled together from scavenged parts and sheer determination. Gears fashioned from crystal spun in perfect harmony. Pistons hammered away with rhythmic precision. Sparks flew as metal met metal under my relentless hands. And then came the engine. It started as an idea, a whisper in the back of my mind during those long nights when sleep refused to come. If I could build an engine powerful enough, if I could harness the energy of this planet's twin suns, maybe, just maybe, I could get off this rock. The Ketheri thought they'd stranded me here forever. They didn't understand what humans were capable of when pushed to their limits. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was building something they couldn't even comprehend. I was going home, and when I did, they'd regret ever leaving me alive. The engine was the heart of my plan, but it was only the beginning. A ship wasn't just an engine strapped to a rock. It needed structure, propulsion, navigation, and shielding. It needed to survive the vacuum of space, the radiation of stars, and the crushing gravity wells that dotted this cursed system. And most importantly, it needed to carry me, a fragile human body that had already been pushed to its limits. I wasn't going to build a coffin. I was going to build a weapon. The Ketheri thought they'd left me broken, but they didn't understand what it meant to be human. We don't break. We adapt. We overcome. And when we're done, we fight back. The first step was fuel. The crystalline spires that dotted the planet weren't just flammable. They were volatile. When crushed and heated under pressure, they released an energy-dense gas that burned hotter than anything I'd ever seen. It wasn't perfect, unstable as hell, and prone to explosions, but perfection wasn't the goal. Survival was. Using my makeshift forge and tools, I built a crude refinery out of scavenged metal and stone. It took weeks of trial and error, more error than I'd like to admit, but eventually I had my first tank of refined crystal fuel. The smell alone could have knocked me out if I wasn't careful, but it burned like a star when ignited. That was all I needed. Next came the hull. The ore veins in the cliffs provided just enough raw material for me to forge plates of metal, thick enough to hold pressure, but light enough for liftoff. Every plate was hammered by hand, every seam welded with molten crystal slag and sheer determination. It wasn't pretty, nothing I made here ever was, but it was strong. Strong enough to withstand the forces I knew were coming. For propulsion, I scavenged parts from the planet itself. The magnetic fields here were unlike anything I'd seen before. Wild and chaotic, but powerful. Using shards of crystal and fragments of ore, I built rudimentary electromagnetic coils that could channel those fields into thrust. It wasn't efficient, but it didn't need to be. It just needed to work. The cockpit was the hardest part. Not because it was technically challenging, but because it forced me to confront what I was really doing. Every lever, every switch, every gauge reminded me of home. Earth, with its blue skies and green fields, and people who didn't even know I was alive out here. My hands shook as I carved out a seat from stone and lined it with strips of fabric torn from my jumpsuit. This wasn't just a ship, it was my lifeline. And then there was the weapon. I hadn't planned on building one at first. All my energy had been focused on escape. But as the months dragged on, and as my hatred for the Ketheri grew, I realized that escape wasn't enough. They needed to know what they'd done. They needed to pay for it. Using the same principles as my propulsion system, I designed a railgun, a crude but devastating weapon powered by electromagnetic coils and fueled by shards of crystal. It wasn't elegant or precise, but it could punch a hole through solid rock from miles away. That was good enough for me. The final piece of the puzzle was navigation. The Ketheri had taken everything from me, including my star charts, but they hadn't taken my memory. I knew where Earth was, or at least where it should be, and I knew how to get there using nothing but the stars as my guide. When the ship was finally complete, I stood back and stared at it for what felt like hours. It wasn't beautiful, not in the way human ships were supposed to be, but it was mine. A patchwork monstrosity of metal and crystal and fire that shouldn't have existed in any sane universe. Yet here it was. I named her Defiance. The launch was chaos, a cacophony of fire and smoke and screaming metal as the engines roared to life for the first time. The ground shook beneath me as Defiance clawed her way into the sky, leaving behind a trail of blue-white flame that lit up the crimson horizon like a second sunrise. As we broke through the atmosphere and into the void beyond, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Hope. But hope wasn't enough. Not anymore. The Ketheri thought they'd won when they left me on that dead world. They thought humanity would bow before their might, broken and defeated. They were wrong. I wasn't just going home. I was bringing war with me. And when I arrived, humanity would rise with me. We weren't just survivors anymore. We were conquerors. The stars stretched out before me, an endless ocean of light and shadow. I had no maps, no beacons, no guidance, but the constellations etched into my memory from a life that now felt like it belonged to someone else. But I knew where I was going. Earth was my destination, but vengeance was my mission. The Ketheri had underestimated me once. They would not get the chance to do so again. The Defiance hummed with raw energy, its crude systems barely holding together under the strain of interstellar travel. Every panel, every wire, Every bolt was a testament to human ingenuity and stubbornness. It wasn't elegant, but it worked, and that was all that mattered. I set my course for Sol, the star that had birthed humanity. It was a long shot. My ship wasn't designed for precision navigation across the vastness of space, but I had faith in the one thing the Ketheri didn't: myself. The twin suns of the desolate planet faded behind me as I pushed the engines to their limit, the crystalline fuel burning hotter than anything I'd ever seen. The ship shuddered violently as we accelerated, but she held together. She always did. The journey through interstellar space was both awe-inspiring and maddening. The void was silent, oppressive in its vastness. Days blurred into weeks as I worked tirelessly to keep the ship running. The electromagnetic propulsion system needed constant adjustments. The shielding against cosmic radiation barely held up under the relentless bombardment of particles. Sleep came in short bursts, haunted by dreams of Earth and the faces of those I'd lost. But then, something unexpected happened. As I approached the outer edges of what should have been empty space, my sensors picked up a faint signal, a pulse of energy too regular to be natural. It wasn't human. It wasn't Ketheri either. It was something else entirely. Curiosity warred with caution as I adjusted course to investigate. The signal grew stronger as I approached its source, a derelict spacecraft drifting in the void, its hull scarred and pitted from centuries, maybe millennia, of exposure to the harshness of space. It was massive, far larger than anything humanity had ever built, its design alien yet strangely familiar. I docked cautiously, my makeshift airlock barely managing to create a seal against the ancient structure's hull. Inside, the ship was a labyrinth of corridors and chambers filled with technology that defied understanding. It wasn't abandoned, at least not entirely. Automated systems still hummed faintly in the background, their purpose inscrutable. And then I found it, a repository of data stored in crystalline matrices similar to the fuel I'd been using for my engines. It took days to decipher even a fraction of it, but what I discovered changed everything. This ship wasn't just alien. It was ancient beyond comprehension, built by a civilization that had mastered interstellar travel long before humanity had even learned to walk upright. They called themselves the Erythians, and their technology dwarfed anything the Ketheri, or humanity, could dream of. But they were gone now, wiped out by something they called the Devourer, an enemy so vast and so powerful that even their advanced technology couldn't stop it. The derelict ship was a relic of their desperate attempt to flee across galaxies, a final testament to their existence. Among their data archives, I found something else: blueprints for weapons and propulsion systems far beyond anything I could have imagined. If I could adapt even a fraction of their knowledge to my own ship, well, let's just say that Earth wouldn't just survive, it would thrive. I worked tirelessly for weeks inside that alien vessel, scavenging parts and integrating Erythian technology into Defiance. The railgun became something far more devastating, a particle cannon capable of firing bursts of energy that could tear through even the densest Ketheri armor. My engines were overhauled with Erythian propulsion systems, allowing me to accelerate at speeds that would have been impossible before. When I finally left the derelict behind, Defiance was no longer just a patchwork ship cobbled together from scraps. It was a war machine forged in fire and desperation. The journey back to Sol took months. Months filled with endless calibrations and tests as I pushed my new systems to their limits. But when Earth's pale blue finally appeared on my sensors, all fatigue melted away. I didn't contact anyone. Not yet. The Ketheri were still there. Their ships orbited Earth like vultures circling a dying animal. They thought humanity was beaten, subjugated under their iron rule. They were wrong. I powered up Defiance's weapons and set course for the largest Ketheri battleship in orbit, a behemoth bristling with cannons and shields that could withstand an entire fleet's assault. I didn't have a fleet. I didn't need one. As I approached, they hailed me, a mix of curiosity and disdain in their guttural language. They didn't recognize my ship. They didn't recognize me. But they would remember what happened next for as long as their kind existed. The first shot from my particle cannon ripped through their shields like paper, carving a glowing scar across their hull. Chaos erupted as smaller ships scrambled to intercept me, but Defiance danced through them with impossible agility, her Erythian engines leaving trails of fire and light in her wake. One by one, the Ketheri's ships fell, some destroyed outright by my weapons, others colliding with each other in their panic to escape this lone human who had become their worst nightmare. When it was over, when the last Ketheri ship had been reduced to debris, I finally opened a channel to Earth. "This is Captain Elias Carter," I said, my voice steady despite everything I'd been through. "I'm coming home, and this time, humanity wasn't just going to survive. We were going to win." The silence that followed my transmission was deafening. For a moment, I thought no one had heard me, that Earth had been silenced in my absence. But then, a voice crackled through the static. A human voice, shaky but alive. "This is Commander Lila Run of the Earth Resistance," it said. "Captain Carter, is it really you? We thought you were." She stopped herself, her voice breaking slightly. "We thought you were gone." I could hear the weight of exhaustion in her words, the kind that came from years of fighting a losing battle. But there was something else there too, something I hadn't heard in far too long. "Hope." "It's me," I replied, my hands tightening on the controls as I surveyed the wreckage of the Ketheri fleet drifting around me. "And I'm not alone. I brought something back with me." The line went silent for a moment. Then her voice returned, this time steadier, sharper. "We're transmitting coordinates for a secure landing zone. Be careful. The Ketheri still control most of the orbital defenses." "Not for long," I said and cut the transmission. The Ketheri weren't going to let this go unanswered. Already, my sensors were picking up reinforcements dropping out of warp on the far side of the system. More of their massive warships, flanked by swarms of smaller fighters. They were regrouping, adapting to my tactics. That was fine by me. Let them come. I pushed Defiance into high gear, her Erythian engines humming with barely contained power as I streaked toward Earth's surface like a meteor. The Ketheri orbital platforms opened fire almost immediately, their plasma cannons lighting up the void with bursts of green energy. But they weren't ready for me. Not for what I'd become. The Erythian shielding absorbed their attacks with ease, dispersing the energy harmlessly across its surface. My particle cannon roared in response, each shot obliterating an entire platform in a single strike. The debris rained down like fireworks against the planet's atmosphere as I carved a path straight through their defenses. By the time I reached the Resistance's coordinates, a hidden base nestled deep within the Andes Mountains, the Ketheri had lost half their orbital presence. The rest were retreating to regroup, no doubt planning their next move. I landed Defiance on a makeshift pad carved into the mountainside, her hull still glowing faintly from re-entry. The moment I stepped out on a solid ground, I was surrounded by Resistance fighters, men and women who looked like they'd been through hell and back. Their uniforms were patched and worn, their faces gaunt with hunger and exhaustion. But their eyes burned with something fierce. Lila Rin stepped forward from the crowd, her expression a mix of disbelief and determination. She was younger than I'd expected, barely 30, but there was steel in her gaze that spoke of years spent leading this ragtag army against impossible odds. "You're really him," she said softly, looking me up and down as if trying to reconcile the legend with the man standing before her. "I'm really him," I replied, my voice rough from years of solitude. "And I didn't come back empty-handed." Her gaze shifted to Defiance, her eyes widening as she took in the alien modifications. The sleek Erythian engines glowing faintly blue, the jagged railgun mounted along its flank. "What is that?" she asked. "A game changer," I said simply. She nodded slowly, then gestured for me to follow her into the base. The interior was a maze of tunnels and chambers carved into solid rock, filled with makeshift workshops and command centers buzzing with activity. Everywhere I looked, people stopped what they were doing to stare at me, some with awe, others with suspicion. Lila led me into a dimly lit war room dominated by a massive holographic display of Earth's surface and its surrounding space. Red markers dotted nearly every continent in orbit, Ketheri strongholds and fleets that had turned humanity's homeworld into a prison. "We've been holding out as best we can," Lila said grimly, pointing to clusters of blue markers representing Resistance forces scattered across the globe. "But we're running out of time. The Ketheri are preparing something big. We don't know what yet, but if we don't act soon, they'll finish what they started." I finished for her. She nodded tightly. I studied the map for a long moment before speaking again. They think they've already won because they control Earth's skies and cities, I said slowly. But they don't understand us. Not really. What do you mean? Lila asked. I turned to face her fully, my expression hard as iron. Humans don't just fight back. We adapt. We innovate. And when we're pushed to our limits, my gaze swept across the room at the gathered resistance fighters hanging on my every word. We win. Her lips quirked into a faint smile despite herself. That's quite a speech. It's not just a speech, I said firmly. It's a promise. Over the next few days, Defiance became more than just my ship. It became humanity's rallying point. Engineers from across the resistance swarmed over her systems like ants on sugar, marveling at the Erythian technology and adapting what they could for their own use. We built weapons, railguns and particle cannons capable of tearing through Ketheri armor like tissue paper, and mounted them on everything from old fighter jets to salvage tanks. We upgraded our communications networks using Erythian data crystals to coordinate strikes across continents in real time. And most importantly, we prepared for war. The Ketheri reinforcements arrived sooner than expected. A fleet larger than anything we'd ever seen before, bristling with firepower designed to crush any resistance once and for all. But this time, we were ready. As their ships descended upon Earth like locusts blotting out the sun, Defiance rose to meet them at the head of an armada unlike anything humanity had ever fielded before. Fighters cobbled together from scrap metal, but armed with alien weapons. Ground forces equipped with shields that could deflect plasma fire. Artillery capable of striking targets in orbit from miles below. This wasn't just survival anymore. It was retribution. And as Defiance surged forward into battle once more, humanity's roar echoed across the stars. We are not broken. We are not defeated. We are human. And we will win this war or die trying. The battle began as a storm of fire and fury, the kind of chaos that could only exist in the void between worlds. The Ketheri fleet descended like a tidal wave, their massive warships blotting out the stars as they unleashed torrents of plasma and missiles. But this time, humanity didn't scatter. This time, we fought back. I led the charge in Defiance, her Erythian engines screaming as I tore through the enemy lines with reckless abandon. The particle cannon fired in rhythmic bursts, each shot carving through Ketheri hulls like a knife through flesh. Fighters swarmed around me, their crude designs no match for the precision of my ship's alien systems. I danced between them, my railgun spitting death with every pass. Behind me, the resistance fleet surged forward, a motley collection of retrofitted ships and salvage fighters, each one bristling with weapons that had no business existing on human vessels. They weren't elegant or efficient, but they were ours, and they were enough. The Ketheri had always relied on their technological superiority to dominate us. They weren't prepared for what we'd become, what I'd brought back with me. Their shields faltered under the relentless assault of our particle cannons. Their formations broke apart as our fighters swarmed them like angry hornets. But it wasn't just about tactics or technology. It was about us. Humans didn't fight like the Ketheri did, cold and calculated, treating war as a game of strategy. We fought with everything we had, with desperation and rage and a refusal to accept defeat. And that made us dangerous in ways they couldn't comprehend. As the battle raged on, I focused on one target, the Ketheri flagship. It was a monstrosity of a ship, larger than anything else in their fleet. A fortress in space bristling with weapons and shields so thick they could shrug off most attacks. It was their command center, their symbol of dominance over Earth. And I was going to tear it apart. I pushed Defiance to her limits, her engines flaring white-hot as I closed the distance. The flagship's guns turned on me immediately, filling the void with streams of plasma and missiles that lit up the darkness like fireworks. My shields flared under the onslaught, alarms blaring as I twisted and turned to avoid the worst of it. But I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was personal. The Ketheri had taken everything from me, my home, my people, my future, and left me to die on that barren rock. They thought they'd broken me, but all they'd done was forge something stronger. As I approached the flagship, I saw it. Their command bridge, a massive dome of reinforced glass at the heart of the ship. Inside, I could make out figures moving, Kethri officers scrambling to respond to this unexpected assault. They saw me coming. Good. I fired everything I had, particle cannon, railgun, even makeshift missiles cobbled together from scavenged parts. The flagship shields flared bright blue as they absorbed the hits, but they couldn't hold forever. Cracks began to form in their defenses as I pressed the attack relentlessly. And then, they broke. The explosion was blinding, a cascade of energy that rippled across the flagship's surface as its shields collapsed under the strain. I didn't hesitate. Defiance surged forward, her railgun firing shot after shot into the exposed hull until I reached the bridge itself. For a moment, time seemed to freeze as I hovered there outside their shattered dome, staring into the eyes of my enemies. They looked afraid. Good. I fired one last shot directly into the bridge. The explosion tore through the flagship like a knife through paper, ripping it apart from within. Pieces of debris spiraled outward in all directions as secondary explosions rippled through its massive frame. The rest of the Kethri fleet faltered at the sight, their command structure shattered in an instant by a lone human ship. That was all it took. The resistance seized the moment, pressing their advantage with everything they had. One by one, Kethri ships fell, some destroyed outright by our weapons, others retreating into warp space to escape annihilation. When it was over, when the last enemy ship had fled or been reduced to rubble, I finally allowed myself to breathe again. Earth's skies were ours once more. I returned to the Resistance base hours later to find celebrations already underway. People cheered and hugged and wept openly as news spread of our victory. For many of them, this was the first real hope they'd felt in years, the first sign that maybe we could win this war after all. But for me, it wasn't enough. Lila found me sitting alone near Defiance, staring up at the stars where so many battles had been fought, and where so many more would be fought still. You did it, she said softly, sitting down beside me. You brought us back from the brink. I shook my head slowly. This isn't over, I said quietly. Not until every last one of them is gone. She nodded after a moment, her expression hardening with resolve. Then we'll finish it together. And so we began planning our next move, not just to defend Earth, but to take the fight to them, to show them what humanity was truly capable of when pushed to its limits. They thought they could break us. They thought wrong. We weren't just survivors anymore. We were warriors forged in fire and vengeance, and we were coming for them next. The celebrations didn't last long. They couldn't. The Kethri might have been driven back, but we knew they'd return. They always did. But this time, we weren't going to wait for them to regroup. This time, we were taking the fight to their doorstep. The resistance rallied like never before. Word of the victory spread across Earth like wildfire, sparking uprisings in cities still under Kethri control. People who had once cowered in fear now rose up with whatever they could find. Makeshift weapons, stolen Kethri tech, even their bare hands. Humanity had been beaten down for years, but now we were angry. And anger is a dangerous thing when you're human. I spent the next few weeks working with Lila and her team to retrofit as many ships as we could with the Erythian technology I brought back. Defiance became the blueprint for a new fleet. Sleek, deadly vessels designed not just to survive, but to destroy. We scavenged every scrap of alien tech we could find, adapting it in ways the Kethri would never expect. It wasn't perfect. Nothing ever was, but it was enough. The plan was simple. Strike at the heart of the Kethri Empire. They'd grown complacent over the years, confident in their superiority. Their fleets patrolled Earth and its surrounding systems, but their core worlds were lightly defended. After all, who would dare attack them? Who would be foolish enough to challenge the might of the Kethri? Humans. That's who. We launched our assault under cover of darkness, or what passed for darkness in space. The fleet surged forward like a spear aimed straight at the Kethri homeworld, a planet they called Vorik. It was a world of towering spires and endless cities, a place where their leaders sat in luxury while their soldiers waged war across the stars. They didn't see us coming. The first wave hit their orbital defenses like a hammer, tearing through their platforms and patrol ships before they even had time to react. Defiance led the charge, her particle cannon ripping holes through their formations as our fighters swarmed around them like angry hornets. The Kethari scrambled to mount a defense, but it was too late. We were already inside their perimeter. As our fleet descended toward Vork's surface, I couldn't help but feel a grim sense of satisfaction. This was what they deserved, what they'd earned for everything they'd done to us. For every city they'd burned, for every life they'd taken, for every moment of suffering they'd inflicted on my people. This was justice. We hit their capital with everything we had. The resistance forces stormed through their streets, overwhelming Kethari soldiers with sheer determination and ferocity. They weren't used to fighting on their own soil. They didn't know how to handle an enemy that wouldn't stop, wouldn't surrender, wouldn't break. For every human that fell, 10 more took their place, driven by a fury that burned brighter than any star. I led a strike team straight into the heart of their command center, a massive fortress carved into a mountain overlooking the city. It was there that I found him, High Commander Zorith, the architect of Earth's subjugation and the one who had ordered me left to die on that desolate planet so many years ago. He stood tall and imposing in his ornate armor, his 4 eyes narrowing as I stepped into the chamber with my makeshift rifle slung over my shoulder. "You," he hissed, his voice dripping with disdain. "The human who refuses to die." "Funny," I said coldly, leveling my weapon at him. "I was about to say the same thing about you." He lunged at me with surprising speed, his claws flashing in the dim light of the chamber. But I wasn't the same man he'd left behind all those years ago. I sidestepped his attack and fired point-blank into his chest. The shot staggered him, but didn't bring him down. His armor absorbed most of the impact. We fought like animals in that chamber, 2 beings from different worlds locked in a struggle that felt almost primal. He was stronger and faster than me, but I was smarter and angrier. In the end, it wasn't strength or speed that won the fight. It was ingenuity. I lured him toward one of the alien power cores lining the walls of the chamber and used my knife, the same knife I'd forged on that barren rock, to sever its containment lines. The resulting explosion tore through Zorith's armor and sent him crashing to the ground in a heap of smoldering flesh and metal. I stood over him as he gasped for breath, his once mighty form reduced to little more than a broken husk. "You, humans," he rasped, blood bubbling from his mouth as he struggled to speak. "You are relentless." I knelt down beside him so he could see my face, the face of someone he thought he'd defeated long ago. "Damn right we are," I said quietly before driving my knife into his throat. With Zorith dead and their capital in ruins, the Kethari Empire began to collapse from within. Their fleets scattered, their colonies rebelled, their leaders turned on each other in desperate bids for power. And humanity? Humanity rose from the ashes stronger than ever before. We didn't just survive, we thrived. Years later, as I stood on Earth's surface watching our new fleet launch into the stars, not as victims but as explorers, I couldn't help but smile at how far we'd come. The Kethari had learned an important lesson, a lesson written in fire and blood across their entire empire. Don't challenge humans, because when you push us too far, we push back harder than you can imagine.